I want to thank you all very much for being here. I know that there's a lot of different media resources and responsibilities making a very just claim for your time, and to spend a little bit of your time in exchange with me is something that I consider a real privilege and I value. So thank you. The theme of tonight's talk, non-human intelligences, is really one that I've never spoken on before. I suppose I've spoken on it in fragments, but it seemed an opportune time to speak on it more concertedly, especially since the theme of non-human intelligences is really roaring into our culture. People specifically are fascinated with the idea of otherworldly intelligences, whether they're ultra-terrestrial, that is to say, belonging to other dimensions, something that I'll be talking about more this evening, or whether they're extraterrestrial, coming from other solar systems, other galaxies. And then there's also the question of non-human intelligences that we might encounter or that individuals report encountering as part of the spiritual search, whether beings encountered in the process of near-death experiences or various magical operations or ghostly visitations, apparitions, or cryptozoological encounters with beings that we might refer to as Bigfoot or Sasquatch or Yeti, or encounters with beings who populate the folklore of different nations, fairies or Alushas or leprechauns or little folks. And in fact, the term non-human intelligences is so broad, maybe too broad, and that's something I'm going to come back to, that it might even include intelligences that we exist with side by side within our very evident and commonly observed terrestrial reality, like simians and dolphins. And there are also our ancient pre-sapient ancestors, such as Neanderthal men and women, who could be considered non-human intelligences. All of this wraps together, even if the term seems especially and uniquely broad. And of course, I must also add to that that some people feel that we're on the precipice of a human-made extra sapient intelligence in the form of AI or artificial intelligence, a term that is almost becoming so widely used. I tend to wonder whether we as a culture have really caught up to its implications as much as we read about it every day. And in fact, whether we've even defined the core term intelligence itself, and what the implications are of using a term so frequently and freely whose meaning has no consensus definition, even among 21st century thinkers, readers, seekers, scientists, and the general public. Um, I got interested in this question of the public exchange around non-human intelligences on the set of the show that I've been doing for Discovery, Alien Encounters, Fact or Fiction. And the show is based heavily upon reports from experiencers, which my colleagues and I evaluate and attempt to come to some sort of a reasonable jury decision to on whether or not what was witnessed could be classified as unidentified. One of the things I noticed among many of the experiencers who came to the table was that a lot of the language that was getting used really bore the markings of our present generation. So much so that any reasonable observer or participant in the query around alien life, let's say, or close encounters or unknown encounters or anomalous encounters, any reasonable observer has to take a breath and pay attention somewhat ruefully to the fact that many people use language that smacks of the popular culture. Many people use language that could almost be seen as a kind of off-the-shelf language, where somebody will talk about a gray, one of these aliens with the almond-shaped dark eyes that are familiar to so many of us today in the culture. It's probably the most familiar alien image, a being with this large cranium and spindly limbs and a expressionless face. That image was probably popularized by Whitley Strieber in his 1984 memoir of some kind of visitation encounter entitled Communion, and I'll be coming back to that. Or people might say a tall gray or a reptilian or something that is very much part of the lingua franca of popular culture at the moment. And there is a kind of pop culture repeat feedback loop that runs through some people's experiences, and that has to be taken note of. But when I take note of that, that doesn't necessarily disqualify from the validity of the person's encounter, because it struck me as I was listening to many, many different witnesses, experiencers, many of whom were really very highly capable people, not infrequently, not infrequently, people with technical backgrounds, maybe an engineer, maybe a computer programmer, maybe a very experienced backyard astronomer, and there are backyard astronomers, as any scientist worth his or her salt can tell you, who have technical training that is absolutely impeccable. Um, some of the people were veterans. They had Air Force or Navy experience. Um, Many of them did some homework before they came to the table. They knew about satellite launches. They knew about software that tracked or reported different kinds of mundane aerial phenomena in the terrestrial skies. They knew about a very wide variety of disqualifiers uh, apropos of UFO or UAP experiencers. And they were very capable and canny people in many cases, in many cases. um, and I think it's almost it occurred to me that it's a given. It's a given that when we have anomalous encounters, we are almost certain to use language, examples, and archetypes that belong to our immediate generation and culture. And this came home to me when, during the course of the show, because of certain things that people were saying, I revisited a book that was published in 1893 by, of all people, President Teddy Roosevelt, who happened to be a very good writer, and it was called The Wilderness Hunter. It was a big two-volume book of Roosevelt's experience in big game hunting all over the world. Um, the ethical concerns around worldwide big game hunting were not acutely felt back in the 1890s because the extinction problem was not as pronounced. So trophy hunting, so to speak, wasn't controversial in the way that for some people it may be today. Although I'm not passing judgment on trophy hunters, there are a lot of animal reserves and such that are set aside actually for uh, sportsman activities. So I'm not rendering a judgment, but it's just something to mention. Anyway, Teddy was telling a story about hunting experiences that he had on the Idaho-Montana border. And at that time, even up to the late 19th century, the Idaho-Montana border was real hardcore wilderness. There might be a few Native Americans remaining in that area. There was very little development, very little trade. You maybe had some game paths, some trappers would pass through, and beyond that, this was hardcore wilderness of a kind that doesn't exist in too many places in North America anymore. And he told a really chilling story in this book um, about what we would probably refer to as a Bigfoot encounter. It's the most, perhaps the most chilling Bigfoot encounter I've ever read. I certainly have returned to it several times. The story was told to Teddy Roosevelt by his guide, who was an old German American guide who said that this encounter had happened to him in that same area several decades earlier when he was a young man. The guide had been out with a colleague or a friend of his, and they were doing some hunting and they were doing some trapping on this in this Idaho, Montana wilderness area. And they felt like they were being followed and being watched, and they could smell some really weird beast that they could not identify that seemed to be hanging around their camp. And it was extra frightening because the forest was covered with a very soft bed of pine needles. So you didn't even really hear footfalls, and it wouldn't be that hard for an animal or some kind of creature to sneak up on you. And one night, um, the trapper and his friend returned to camp after a day of hunting and setting traps, and they found that their camp had been ransacked. Their lean-to was knocked over, and their stuff was scattered all over the place. And they figured, oh, a bear came into our camp, and all right, now we have to repair the whole thing. So they repaired the whole thing, and it got dark. They made dinner. They had a fire lit, and one of the guys took like a bright burning coal from the fire or a brand, and he used it to follow the tracks that led away from their camp. And he came back and he sort of stared into the fire for about 2 minutes, and he said to his partner, "Listen, whatever it was that destroyed our camp, that thing was walking on two legs." And the guy went, "Oh, come on, man, you're crazy." And they took another brand out of the fire and they followed the tracks again, and they realized this thing was walking on two legs. And they were pretty creeped out. And they, that night, smelled this really rancid, awful odor around camp. And I guess this is where the expression not happy campers comes from, because they decided in the morning they were going to get out of there. They were seriously spooked. And these were experienced hunters. And so they split up their tasks. They decided one guy would strike camp, another guy would go check on some traps they had laid down by a river a little lower down from the area where they were staying. What was the Wisdom River, actually. It was the Wisdom River. And so the one trapper went down to the Wisdom River, and he had some trouble with the traps. One of the beavers had dragged one of the traps into its dam, the dam that the beaver had made. And he retrieved the trap, retrieved the beaver. He was occupied for several hours. And he came back to camp, and the sun was starting to set, and he found that his friend had been murdered, that his friend had been shaken back and forth, and there were four fang marks on his friend's neck. So his friend had been, wasn't eaten, but was shaken back and forth by this what obviously must have been a very powerful being, and had four fang marks on his neck. His throat had been torn open, and again, there was an unmistakable track marks of an upright being that had entered and left the camp just as they had seen earlier. And he realized that there was something hovering around the camp, and He had his rifle with him, obviously, and he shot at it, and he thought he saw this big simian-like being, what we would call Bigfoot or Sasquatch, and the being took off and ran, and the hunter, of course, gathered up his stuff, and even though it was near nightfall, got out of there as quickly as possible. What struck me about the story was not just its verisimilitude and its vintage, but the language that Teddy Roosevelt used. He called it a goblin encounter. Goblin is a term that sounds antiquated to us today, but it wasn't for several decades that the terms Bigfoot, Yeti, Sasquatch would come into use. As it happens, in North America, from let's say the Canadian Yukon area down to the Pacific coast, let's say the coast of Oregon, the Pacific Northwest. There were well over 500 distinct Indian tribes. In each of these tribes had its own term for some sort of wild, unknown being, a man-like being, dwelling in the woods. Now, why would Indian tribes from Portland, Maine to Eugene, Oregon, who had no traditional means of communication, all have that same terminology, a terminology that also exists in tribes that occupy the Arctic Circle? One of those tribes is known as the Cree. They're still there. Different Eskimo tribes, Inuit tribes, Tibetan indigenous people. They all have terms for a simian-like creature. And they're all different and they're all distinct terms. It would seem a damn big waste of time for people who had no means of communicating with one another, who had no common shared culture. These were distinct groups occupying different geography. We could, of course, have a wonderful evening discussing questions of extraphysical communication. I'm all for that, but for now, I'm going to stick with the pedestrian and say that none of these tribes per se had ways that we know of communicating, and they all had the same experience, frequently enough so that they all had a term and a name, just like we do, just like we do. We all have terms and names. Everybody here has some conception of what a goblin is, or what the boogeyman is, or what a fairy is, or what have you. Sure. But the names that we defer to much more frequently are names that are of this particular cultural moment. And so those terms and those names tend to run in the direction of, again, as I was saying earlier, an ET, a tall white, a gray, a reptilian. And yes, of course, we also use terms like Bigfoot and so forth. And if you go to a different region or a different part of the world, people will have their own terms for all these things. In Latin America, if you want to talk about little men who occupy the highlands and woods, they're called Aleutians. In England, fairies, fae folk. In Ireland, leprechauns, and so on and so forth around the world. There are terms in Africa. So it struck me as very possible that we're just drawing upon language that belongs to our generation, and that doesn't serve to discredit the reports of people who believe that they've had experiences, so much as we have to historically understand that we may all, it seems to me, I mean, this is the thesis of my talk tonight, that we may all be having the same conversation as we're trying to come up with some consensus language vocabulary, profile for encounters that are not only as old as humanity, but, and I mean this very literally, and I'm going to be very clear about it, older than humanity, that are prehistoric. And this is what I mean. Um, One of the extraordinary facts of I want to say the human story, but it includes the pre-human story, is the existence of some of the very forms that I've just been talking to you about among our pre-sapien, pre-human ancestors, specifically what is called Neanderthal men and women. Neanderthal men and women who predate our presence on this planet. They are, in some respects, our eldest known ancestors. Um, were not human beings in the strictest of sense. They were not Homo sapiens. They were Homo Neanderthal. They were different. They were different from us. They existed approximately from about 150,000 years ago to probably their point of extinction 40,000 years ago. And they bore a great similarity to us with differences. Their craniums were shaped very differently. They were more oblong than ours, which are more rounded and bulbous. So the brain matter that sat within their craniums obviously was different and was presumably possessed, as it must be, of a different biology, or at least differences in biology than the brain matter that we possess. And I I have been very touched to discover, I've been very, very touched to discover that our Neanderthal ancestors, think of it, these are pre-human ancestors. These are not human beings. These are Homo neanderthals. Our Neanderthal ancestors possessed a spirituality, a belief in the coexistence of an extra physical world. Whenever I say spirituality, I really mean extra physical. And we know this because not only did our Neanderthal ancestors engage in what we would call arts and crafts, arts and sciences, even the making of tools such as hatchets, axes, hammers, spears, hunting apparatus. Um, but they also crafted talismans, necklaces, um, little statuary composed of eagle claws or bear claws, eagle talons or bear claws, which may have been um, more than just decorative, because everything I think had to be useful in a primeval society. Everything had to have a use. And these things may have been injunctions to unseen entities wishing for help with the hunt and help with fertility. One of the extraordinary things that we as a 21st century human community possess from our pre-human antiquity are these little statuettes. There are hundreds of them in museums around the world, which in the 19th century were given the somewhat hokey name of Venus statuettes. Venus statuettes. You see, we're using a Roman god, god of beauty, god of fertility, or a Greco-Roman god, to classify the activities of our pre-human ancestors. Because what do? We reach off the shelf and we use terminology from our own era. That's what we as humans do all over the world. And so these so-called Venus statuettes are believed to be um, fertility talismans. You can find them online. They are round, bulbous, almost a Buddha-like statues, a certain kind of Buddha that you might have um, grown up with, seeing in restaurants and things. A certain um, hoary, happy, almost Santa Claus-like Buddha who is supposed to bring you good luck. And and these Venus statuettes are a feminine form, very bulbous, very broad, bulbous, broad breasts, bulbous, broad hips, and hundreds of them have survived from a a civilization that went extinct 40,000 years ago. And these things were small, maybe about 4.5 inches or so, and they could be carried around. They were portable, very important for a so-called hunter-gatherer society. Agriculture hadn't been fully developed yet, so you eat what you kill. And so people had to travel around, follow herds, follow migration patterns. Again, look how I defer to the language of I'm saying people. They weren't people. They were Neanderthals, and they were our ancestors. They were our ancestors. And the Neanderthal civilization was a nomadic civilization by necessity because they lived by the hunt. And so they apparently, based on what we are able to understand, would carry around these Venus statues as maybe a petitionary tribute, a petitionary appeal to those forces that could help with fertility. Survival was an everyday game. Life expectancy, very short. Maybe you'd make it to your 30s. Maybe if you were lucky, you'd make it to your 40s. Disease, hunger, um, animals preying upon different human groupings, occasional wars and breakouts of violence among people who might have been fighting over resources, the cold, the elements, very, very tough existence. And and hence life was so precarious. I don't think it's possible for us even to understand sometimes the brutality of life in the 19th century, much less among our pre-human ancestors. Their survival itself is extraordinary. So it stands to reason that fertility and the hunt were the chief concerns, and shelter too, of course, fertility, hunt, shelter, the chief concerns among a civilization attempting to survive. And nobody had time for speculation or nonsense, or there were no luxuries, there were no obvious wastes of time. What could you possibly do with yourself? There was a constant wish for survival, and they had apparently a spirituality. They had objects that we would recognize right off the bat. There's an extraordinary continuum, almost a universal language in the form of these talismans and statuettes that we would understand today. And it raises for me a remarkable question, or prospect, and that is the following. Strict materialist skeptics of religion, strict physicalist philosophers of religion will usually tell you one of two things. Religion is or spirituality of whatever type is a mere byproduct of brain chemistry, brain biology. It soothes fears. It gives us a serotonin hit, or it gives us a dopamine hit. And there's always some headset wearing TED Talk expert, usually a neuroscientist, who will be delighted to tell you that certain parts of your brain electrically light up when you're making a spiritual appeal, or you think you're having some sort of a revelatory experience, and this coincides with the release of dopamine or serotonin. So we're just moist robots having a neurochemical experience, and that's that. That's one line of reasoning. Another line of reasoning is that we as human beings have various sociological, um, anthropological needs to believe that there's a big daddy somewhere that's looking out for us, and hence religion is nothing but a way of metaphorically keeping the lights on at night because we're frightened of the boogeyman. Okay. Those are the arguments, and there are ways that those arguments could be countered. But it seems to me, leaving aside all the kind of polemical partisan debates over all this stuff, that the Neanderthals themselves were presumably possessed of a different brain chemistry than ours, for the simple fact that their craniums were shaped differently. We know this. And there's no reason to assume that their neurochemical processes were the same as ours, nor was their culture the same as ours, affirming different kinds of religious belief, rewarding different kinds of religious belief. Of course, one could draw extrapolations between our 20th, 21st century cultures and their so-called prehistoric cultures and say, well, human, pre-human, we're all the same, but we don't know that. We don't know that. That's a supposition. What we do know is that they constructed apparent spiritual structures that ring so universally true and recognizable in terms of modern and pre-modern human practices, that we could recognize them with the same immediacy that we might recognize a hatchet or a spear or another vital survival tool. And to me, it beckons the prospect that spirituality is neither biological nor cultural, but is realization. Because the culture and the biology of Homo sapiens versus Homo neanderthals is so vastly different, and in many respects, of course, unknown, that to witness the tools of an identifiable spiritual process among intelligent pre-human ancestors suggests realization, suggests universality, suggests that the common journalistic tropes or academic speculations about religion as a physicalist or materialist byproduct, epiphenomenon, or pathology of the human condition has this massive gaping hole in it, because we see a reach for the ineffable and a personification. Again, you'll have to forgive me because that's not quite the right term, but an individualized picturing of a deific force, personage, entity, to which appeal can be made. The Neanderthals didn't look like the statuary that they made. They weren't bulbous. They were thin. They were contending with hunger. They were possibly emaciated at times because in such a society, when you eat what you kill, there's no luxury of additional caloric intake. They were identifying something across vast stretches of Africa, Europe, Eurasia, the Far East, wherever we found Neanderthal remains. They were identifying like individualized, unseen beings to which an appeal could be made. And they were identifying within some of the game that they were seeking to hunt a kind of extra-physical coexistence that they thought could be summoned, beckoned, called to them. The occult formulation is as above, so below, or like attracts like, called to them by use of relic-like objects of some of the game that they were seeking to hunt. There are so many things that I could talk to you about with regard to stories and testimony and other things that touch upon perceptual studies, which I'm going to get to in just a moment. But the historicism of pre-humanity and the shared commonality around spirituality or belief in and appeal to, petition to the extra-physical is an extraordinary part of the story of life on this terrestrial globe. Modern people have been fascinated for centuries with the question of extra-physical existence. And this has taken so many different forms. It took a certain form in the spiritualist era. It took many, many vast-ranging forms in antiquity, in civilizations that span the globe for millennia, literally. And in our own era, it takes a great many different forms. The one that has perhaps the keenest popularity today is the question of the alien life form. What is it? Why is it? Is it real? Is it fantasy? Is it imaginary? And so on and so forth. I mentioned Whitley Strieber and his wife Anne Strieber earlier. I first met Whitley, and we've worked together a while. Back in my publishing days, I published about 4 of Whitley's books, and I wrote an introduction to his most recent book, which is called Them. It's a good book. I recommend it. I first met Whitley in 2009 at a retreat at the Esalen Institute. It was just before my book, Occult America, came out, and it was a conference for people from a wide variety of different fields who study the metaphysical, the extra-physical, and so they got together people from the humanities, physics, seekers, kind of independent seekers like me, people who have written within the so-called UFO space like Whitley. And In preparation for the conference, I read Whitley's memoir, Communion, which I had never read before, and I was really enchanted with it. It's not only vivid and compelling, but it's very specific. It names places, dates, people in a practice that I think people who write about the paranormal ought to make a point of following. And I saw he was standing out looking at the Pacific Ocean off this little patio in this meeting house where some of the guests were gathering. He was out there by himself. And I wanted to go out and say hello to him. So I opened up the door, and the waves were crashing into the rocky Pacific coast. So there was kind of this white noise, and you couldn't hear very well. And I walked out there, and his back was to me, and I wanted to say hello. And I said, "Excuse me, Whitley." And he almost jumped out of his skin. He jumped out of his skin. And I it struck me at that moment that this is a man suffering from PTSD. It seemed to me that his encounters with unknown visitors had left him in a state of high anxiety. Um, and he was struggling with the bodily trauma of a profoundly disturbing event, something that I think he would certainly attest to himself. And his wife Anne was still living at that time, very warm person. And Anne had taken it upon herself to catalog the many thousands of letters, literally thousands of letters, that Whitley had received in the wake of publishing Communion, of people who felt seen for the very first time in their lives, in their adult lives, who themselves had had alien encounters of some kind or another, and wanted to reach out to the Strebers as people who could understand this. And so Anne spent many years cataloging these letters, which are today archived at Rice University, thanks to Professor Jeff Kripal there. And Anne made a statement to Whitley one day, poring over all the letters. She said, "Whitley, whatever is going on amidst all these encounters, it has something to do with life after death. There's some kind of relationship between what the experiencers are reporting and life after death." And he believed, I think rightly, that there was a profundity in Anne's observation. And I suppose it speaks to the theme that I'm wrestling with this evening, which is that humanity and pre-humanity has been reporting encounters with unknown intelligences, let's say non-human intelligences, not only since the dawn of humanity, but since the dawn of pre-humanity. Hence, it seems to me, we should fall to our knees in front of that simple but undigestible, astonishing, awe-inspiring fact. We should fall to our knees in front of it. And that's why I think that although all of us, myself included, are going to keep using language that speaks to our time, place, and culture, we mustn't get hung up on this language. We must permit ourselves to be flexible about this language. I don't care whether someone says goblin or Bigfoot. I don't care whether someone says reptilian or gray or whatever. I mean, of course I care. I'm not trying to be glib. Different encounters have different folds, meanings, experiences, yes. But I don't want to get ourselves in the culture of search, hemmed into a kind of orthodoxy, or hemmed into a kind of a repeat use of language that limits our ability to be flexible, to search, to morph, to change. I have a sympathy. I have a sympathy for these accounts, and I say that in by way of disclosure. I say that in a cautionary way because it's a malady of human nature that all of us read preferentially. I read preferentially. Skeptics read preferentially. We write, we communicate preferentially. We believe what is in line with our perceived self-interest. And it is a malady of human nature. And anybody who thinks that he or she is free of it is probably the worst offender among us. It's a very serious blind spot in human nature. So it's very difficult to get to any kind of intelligent consensus around any of this. But I must say the following, and I ask that you hear this very clearly. The philosophies known as materialism or physicalism in their strictest senses have expired. They've expired intellectually, even though they're dominant culturally. And it's very, very important to be watchful for this, because I think it's an important pivot point in our modern human story. The philosophy of materialism, which has held sway in the Western world for perhaps 300 years or so, holds that everything is an epiphenomena of matter, that matter creates itself, that everything is a chemical process, that that your thoughts, whatever they are, whatever a thought actually is, are just like bubbles in a carbonated glass of water. And when the water is gone, the bubbles are gone, and that's that. Well, that philosophy is obsolete. It doesn't hold up. It no longer covers the bases of observation in 20th and 21st century life. Excuse me as I perform a materialist process. And it is it is a very compelling philosophy to much of academia, much of our therapeutic culture, and much of the irrigation channels from those worlds, most especially mainline media or opinion making mainstream media. And these philosophies are compelling because they work up to a point, but no one questions the limits of their empiricism. I'm speaking colloquially, of course. Lots of people question the limits of their empiricism, but very few people who contribute to the parapsychology articles on Wikipedia, very few people who work at opinion making or once upon a time opinion making media, very few people within the academic humanities and social sciences. There's a great deal more liberalism in the hard sciences and medicine. Very few people who participate in the therapeutic culture, with exceptions. Some of those exceptions might be with us tonight. And the contention that everything is matter and that matter creates itself and that everything you experience is an epiphenomena of matter has failed in the face of world-class science. The founders of quantum theory themselves were philosophical idealists. The founders of world-class modern hard science were philosophical idealists. In other words, they believed in a perceptual dimension or component or premise to reality, that human perception was not just a matter of a prejudice or bias or preordained thinking, but it was an actual correlative or causative tool in determining what appears in actual reality. I'm going to come back to that in a moment. The founders of the most compelling modern philosophy, which would be idealism, were in direct agreement, as it happens, with the founders of particle physics and quantum theory, which is to say, Kant, Hegel, were of the belief for which they argued with the most assiduous logic that reality was a product of human perception, sensory data that not only allowed us to interpret the world, but proved determinative of the world, not just interpretation, but positive, causative action arose from perception, not just in terms of cognition or motor skill. I wish to pick up this, or I wish to, move this over there, but actual concretization of experience based on measurement, based on sensory data. It stands to reason that that phenomena doesn't just go away in our above ground macro world. And it stands to reason that the logical necessity of simultaneous outcomes might announce itself, might express itself, might exist under the rubric of terms that we use, like different dimensions or different intersections of time. This is what string theory is all about. String theory postulates that everything that is a thing exists on these undulating bands of strings, which is why there's a so-called mirror effect, not only within particle physics, but within macro astronomy as well, something observed by Sir Isaac Newton himself, that objects at a distance seem to affect one another with no evident, obvious point of connection. This is what Einstein somewhat derisively referred to as spooky action at a distance. Well, string theory is a conceptualized model of reality that seeks to explain why things with no obvious connection affect one another, because these different dimensions or intersections of time all exist along these undulating bands of strings, and something that might be happening in one of these intersections of time that we don't necessarily see commonly is affecting stuff that's going on in the world that we do commonly see. And it could be, and I'm just making a leap of supposition here, but I think it's a reasonable leap, to the extent that I think what I've explored provides a sufficient enough springboard to sustain this leap. It could be that this vast, millennia-spanning record of encounters that we possess, going from our pre-human ancestors up right through today, maybe consists of some of us getting glimpses of, experiencing things that do simultaneously coexist with us along different strings or bands of reality, different intersections of time, different dimensions. The computer scientist and UFO theorist Jacques Vallée reasoned that actually aliens, ETs, might more likely be explained as beings who are interdimensional rather than extraterrestrial. And I'm very sympathetic to that point of view because the fact is, we have better conceptual models, some of which I've just been describing, of interdimensionality than we do of extraterrestriality. The real tough aspect of the extraterrestrial thesis is spanning these vast distances, vast distances. How could it be done? Can something move faster than light? Because even light speed is insufficient for there to be any kind of real interstellar contact. Well, we have theories that there are things that are referred to as cosmic wormholes, and the theory is if you introduce some piece of exotic matter into space, you may be able to create a portal where time-space collapses. We know that time bends. We know Einstein was right, that time is not an absolute. Time itself is conceptual. We experience linear time as an absolute reality. And yes, it's overwhelmingly persuasive and I presume overwhelmingly necessary, but it ain't ultimate reality. Time bends at or near the velocity of light speed. And in fact, as I've mentioned previously, astronauts in our own era, even though they're moving nowhere near the velocity of light, do demonstrate minute but measurable reductions in the aging process. It's surreal, but true, but factual. Just like gravity, just like electricity, just like a wave state, or if my purist friends insist, a wave function, that only concretizes into reality upon observation. We don't know why, but we know that it is. We know that it is. So my contention, given that our interdimensional models are better worked through than our intergalactic models or our interstellar models, my contention is that all of these encounters, all of these reports, all of this testimony, and yes, all of this evidence, I'm going to get to that in 1 second, points to the possibility that we are experiencing beings from different intersections of time or different dimensions or different bands of string. And believe me, they may be just as freaked out to see us as we are to see them. You know, we're always assuming, we as a human community are always assuming, oh, this is purposeful. They're coming with an environmental message. They're coming for this. They're coming for that. They may be like, who the fuck are these beings? You know, and they want to get out of here, you know, as much as we want to get out of their way. I don't know. I mean, you know, I'm just sort of you know, talking kind of friend to friend at this point, but I do believe that these are real possibilities that our generation ought to be grappling with, for a very particular reason, and I'm going to get to that in just a moment. Now, evidence. By the way, I just want to say a little quick and fast word about evidence. There are insistencies that even impressive as the current crop of high-def video or radar-based evidence is for UFOs, it's not enough. the benighted Neil deGrasse Tyson says, "Hey, you abductees, next time you're abducted, come back with an ashtray, and then I'll believe you." Well, people have come back with an ashtray, so to speak. People have come back with an ashtray, so to speak. In 2010, actually, it was December of 2009, December 2009, the Defense Intelligence Agency released a report, which you can find online in PDF at a .gov site, which disclosed that Air Force and Navy personnel were displaying signs of bodily trauma, including radiation burns, after flyovers by objects, aerial objects of unknown technology. And when I read this, my jaw fell open. I thought to myself, this is as close to a holy grail of UFO reportage and marshaling of concrete physical evidence as anything that we've ever seen. It is, to my mind, equally momentous to the wonderful, epic-shaping reportage done by Leslie Kean, Ralph Blumenthal, and Helene Cooper on the cover of the New York Times in 2017 about the Pentagon maintaining a previously undisclosed UFO tracking program and the verification of cockpit footage of the so-called Tic Tac UAP. This 2010 recently declassified Defense Intelligence Agency report documented physical evidence in the form of bodily trauma and specifically radiation burns on the bodies of Air Force and naval personnel following flyovers, and I'm very closely paraphrasing, by objects, aerial objects of unknown technology. That is a plain, clear acknowledgement of UFO activity, now close to 15 years old, leaving empirical evidence in the form of radiation burns identified as such by military medical professionals. Of course, we have physical evidence. Of course, we have physical evidence. On the show, Alien Encounters, there was a geologist, Frank Kimbler, who was a earth scientist and an associate professor of geology at New Mexico Military Academy, who came on the show, and he felt that he had found an unexplained metallic fragment at the alleged Roswell crash site. We tested it and found that, in fact, according to the lab report that we received, the object was composed of a pure aluminum, that it showed impact, that it showed markings of manufacture, that it showed damage from combustion explosion, but that it was pure aluminum, which was very unusual because pure aluminum is it's too flexible, it's too unstable, it's not an alloyed compound. Aluminum in its pure form is not used for manufacturing simply because it's too unstable. So Frank, who is himself a trained geologist, found this fragment at the alleged crash site. And although it shows signs of manufacturing impact and combustion explosion, it's made of a material that is not used anywhere in our industrial society for manufacturing, aerial or otherwise. And Frank further explained to me that the lab report found that a, a very small atomic measurement below the surface shows an aluminum alloy of unknown compound. Now, this is something that I haven't studied, and further tests need to be done, specifically radiation tests, to determine whether this particle that Frank found has an extraterrestrial origin. It's obviously not that unusual that extraterrestrial objects strike Earth. I'm wearing one myself. This stone is moldavite, which comes from a meteor that crashed some 10,000 years ago in what is now Eastern Europe. But the point I'm trying to get at now, by the way, the radiation tests were unaffordable for us. They cost about $7,000. Not a huge sum of money. If somebody wants to slap down a credit card and do it, it's a damn good way of forwarding pure questioning. In science, it does destroy the particle. And I'm hopeful that funds will soon become available to perform a radiation test on Frank's particle. The barriers are not that high, and this is the kind of thing that helps the conversation. But I say this not to get lost in a tangent, but to say to you that we have verified physical evidence. We have high def cockpit and radar footage. We have radiation burns on military personnel following a dead to rights description of UFOs, and this is just that data and material that has been disclosed. We have it. And so we need to sort of move the conversation beyond these glib remarks and start to ask, well, are we going to test this evidence further? Are we going to properly fund and pursue the field on significantly serious enough grounds so that we can test and gather more? And what will we learn? I couldn't begin to say, other than the fact that it's a misnomer, and it's a kind of a canard to say, in fact, that we have no physical evidence, ashtray or not. So my wish tonight for myself and for all of you who have been good enough to join in this exchange is that we explore, we seek, we not get held up by language, we not get held up by glibness, we unplug from people, institutions, settings, situations that stymie rather than foster the search. And we honor this generational moment where we face a kind of new day in terms of human inquiry, because our physicalist and materialist philosophies, they've exhausted themselves. They failed at this juncture intellectually to cover all the myriad bases of life. And we are, as a human seeking community, going to be playing catch up for a while. These next 30 years, for those of us who are here to see them, I might just make it, are going to be an interesting time, because there are new verities, defensible, mature, sustainable, bubbling up from the human story. Many of them very ancient, coming back to us today. And these new verities are going to require probing and exploration so that we can move the human story forward. And not get stuck with philosophies and outlooks that belong in a museum, but let's create new horizons rather than new museums. Thank you so much.